You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Greeks Gridiron and to another edition of UFL News Desk as we sit down and discuss all the latest happenings within the United Football League over the last few days, as plenty has gone on. We're going to discuss the Super Draft that wrapped up on Monday. We'll talk a bit of free agency as well, and a coach's interview that just released not too long ago on top of that. So a few things on deck for today. So I invite you to comment down below. Let me hear your thoughts. I want to hear you weigh in on the conversation. But first things first, we'll start off with the Super Draft that wrapped up on Monday. It went a total of 14 rounds as teams were selecting in the same order again and again and again, adding to their rosters as they continue to build and get ready for training camp in about a month or so. Former Orlando Guardians quarterback Quinton Dormady went number 1 overall to the San Antonio Brahmas, and the Memphis Showboats making the final pick of the draft, taking in, I guess, what you would call Mr. Irrelevant, defensive tackle Willie Henry, who played with the Birmingham Stallions of last season. Now, there were a number of selections made throughout this draft, but it didn't necessarily mean that every single team was selecting every single round. Oddly enough, we had as few as 5 picks made by a team, and then we had as high as 14 with the Memphis Showboats leading the way. But like I said, the Arlington Renegades with only 5 selections in this, a championship team from last season in the XFL. The Roughnecks and Panthers were right behind them, sitting at 6 selections, but again, the Memphis Showboats rounded out the top with 14. I believe the DC Defenders were second with 12. So it was very interesting to see how some teams elected to continue to make picks going through the draft, while others, got a few of the guys that they were looking for, and then from that point forward, we're just like, all right, we'll stick it out for the rest of free agency. Now, some notable draftees I do want to highlight here because there were a few names and a couple of interesting selections I thought were worth pointing out here. In round number 7, the Memphis Showboats, they went and drafted themselves defensive back Will Likely. Now, Likely had a slower, I would say, 2023 than he did in 2022, but for those of you in the USFL community who remember Will Likely, he was a menace on the Gamblers defense, notching 4 interceptions that season. He was a stud. So to have him coming back to the USFL side of things, hopefully, for his sake, he can maybe recapture some of that magic from 2022 and get back to dominating on defense the way he did, being an absolute nightmare for quarterbacks to throw to. Round 1, Panthers also went ahead, added some defensive back help themselves. They went and got defensive back Nate Brooks from the championship of 2023 I almost said New York Stallions, Birmingham Stallions. With 2 interceptions and 43 tackles, Nate Brooks is an excellent addition here for a Panthers defense that was pretty impressive. So for them to go and add a guy who's championship caliber, I mean, good luck to offenses planning to play against that defense in Michigan there, because it's going to be a pretty good unit. In round 1 as well, this one I definitely think is worth highlighting here because there's a lot of questions surrounding it. We have the DC Defenders going ahead and selecting quarterback Jalen McClendon, with so much conversation right now in regards to Jordan Te'amu and if he's going to return or if he's going to opt to take his talents to the CFL because of the restructuring of the pay scale in the UFL. I do think that there is a little bit of a this might be a cause for concern because now they have 2 quarterbacks on the roster. I'm not saying that there isn't the possibility that Te'amu could come back, but this draft selection right here feels like there is a larger possibility now that we potentially see Te'amu take his talents up north to the CFL, where they could probably offer him more money, probably find himself a starting spot up there as well, so you get exposure, and on top of that, you can also secure yourself with the financial side of things as well. So definitely one that I think is worth keeping an eye on. And then another one here, one that I wanted to bring up because I feel like kickers and punters don't quite get the love that they deserve sometimes, but this is definitely worth mentioning here. In round 3, the Houston Roughnecks went ahead and selected kicker Luis Aguilar, who, in my opinion, second best kicker in the league, at least from what I've seen to this point as far as spring football has gone the last couple of years. Aguilar was a stud for a Stars team that last year struggled a bit to get the ball into the end zone. He was called upon many a times to kick in a litany of field goals in several games, and I do think that bringing in a guy like Aguilar, who, for what it's worth, Brandon Aubrey, who is an NFL All-Pro right now, kicking the world on fire over in the NFL side of things, he outscored Brandon Aubrey last season. So just something to keep in mind. He is a guy that you can count on when you need him most. If your offense is just struggling to get into the end zone, he's a guy you can rely on, and I think that's a really good addition for the Houston Roughnecks there. Now, Switching gears, we'll move on from the USFL Super Draft. And again, if there's any notable draftees or anyone that you feel like I didn't mention here, I just kind of threw out a few names that kind of stuck out to me as I was running through the list here. But if you have anyone worth mentioning, feel free to fire in that comment section down below. But now we're going to talk free agency, because this is where things really open up. Players that are not selected in this Super Draft or weren't selected in dispersal draft before are all now free to sign with whichever team they would like to sign with. So that began as of yesterday, Tuesday the 16th, for those of you that might be watching a few days down the road whenever you end up seeing this. And players have already begun signing, and some players are still sitting out there, surprisingly, and we'll get to that in a second, but the opportunity is there. First signing so far, St. Louis Battlehawks wide receiver Darius Shepard returning to St. Louis with 1,400 all-purpose yards last season and an XFL Special Teams Player of the Year award. This is literally a no-brainer for St. Louis. This is a guy who obviously fit really well in your offense. He looked really good in the USFL the year prior as well, and he took things even further in the following year in the XFL with the Battlehawks. Like I said, literally a no-brainer signing. I would be more shocked if this had not happened than did happen. The second signing that came out a little bit earlier today, DC Defenders went ahead and signed themselves an NFL player in defensive tackle Robert Nkemdiche, a former first-round selection of the Arizona Cardinals in 2016. He had his best season in 2018, notching 4.5 sacks with 32 tackles, 9 of them being for a loss in 10 games for the Cardinals. Somebody who came into the NFL with a ton of talent, so much so he was literally drafted in the first round. Now, the DC Defenders already have a pretty stout unit up front, and to bring in a guy like Robert Nkemdiche, who could bring some serious problems for offensive lines to deal with on the interior, best of luck, because I think this is a phenomenal signing for a DC team that loves their defense and at this point just tipped the scales well in their favor with such a massive addition. As of right now, though, that's pretty much it as far as I've seen, unless something has flown under the radar that I have not seen. Those are the only two significant signings that I have seen posted around in the last couple of days. I expect UFL free agency to be a little bit slower. It's probably not going to be something that is going to light the world on fire, where we're going to be seeing massive signings. It's not like the NFL, but there is a good possibility where we see guys like Robert Nkemdiche, guys that are maybe a few years into their career looking to get back in the NFL, or maybe some guys who've been overlooked that potentially opt to jump into this new merged league now with the two leagues coming together with even more exposure now potentially possible. Would not be surprised to see maybe some of those lower guys that you see on NFL rosters or guys that bounce around from practice squads maybe opting to sign over to get the playing time, especially now with the NFL season wrapping up. This is a really good time to be bringing players in, because we've seen guys have success going into the NFL coming off of spring football season. I think Khalil Davis, a guy who is still in the playoffs right now, is definitely worth mentioning, as he has basically snatched away a starting role on the interior defensive line of the Houston Texans as a guy who is a prime example of that. And then, of course, you have yourself Brandon Aubrey and, of course, Kavonte Turpin as well. Now, outside of the free agency stuff, this was something that kind of just popped up on my Twitter feed, and I decided to sit down and give a read on the article, and I was actually really glad I did, because there's a lot of good tidbits of information in this one here. Greg Palermo of Spectrum Local News sat down the other day to discuss an interview with head coach Anthony Becht of the St. Louis Battlehawks, kind of his outlook going into training camp and just maybe roster additions, things like that. Also, what's going on with AJ McCarron, because that is a big question right now for the Battlehawks. And on top of that, a couple of other things got mentioned as well in terms of playoff format discussion and kickoff rule discussion as well. So first, we'll get the Battlehawks stuff out of the way here. It sounds like head coach Anthony Becht anticipates a decision from AJ McCarron within the next couple of weeks. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what AJ McCarron did in the XFL last season, how about this? Nearly 69% completion percentage, sitting at 68.8%. That was best in the XFL. He was second in passing yards with 2,150, and he was first in the XFL with 24 total touchdowns. AJ McCarron was a stud for the Battlehawks last season. It was lightning in a bottle, and maybe it could strike twice, but that was an awesome performance on his end from last season. Like I mentioned previously, I didn't follow the XFL as it was happening. I have gone back to kind of try to, catch up a little bit and kind of see what I missed out on and try to, I guess brush up on my knowledge in regards to the XFL. And I don't think anyone can really sit here and deny what AJ McCarron was able to do with the Battlehawks last season. It was a pretty fun performance to watch. The second thing that got, I guess, confirmed now, because if it's being told to the head coaches, it sounds like this is something that is going to happen here, and we're just kind of waiting for the league to tell us. But if a head coach is outright saying it, I definitely think you could consider this confirmed. He has been told that the playoff format going into 2024 will be 2 conference champions and then the 2 best teams record-wise, regardless of conferences. So there's a potential that one of these conferences could send 3 teams to the playoffs, as opposed to it just being 2 from one side and 2 from the other. I know there was kind of a controversy with the way records stood and how things kind of shook out with the XFL last season, and even with the USFL a little bit as well. It's always weird when you only have like 8 teams and maybe one conference is more lopsided than the other. And I kind of like this. And this is something that I've kind of like subscribed to and wanted the NFL to even consider doing more recently, because I hate seeing teams that are with lesser records hosting football games against teams that are, 3 or 4 wins ahead of them, but because they didn't win their division, because they're in a far more competitive division, they don't get the opportunity to host a game. I'm actually a really big fan of this. So to see that this is the direction that they're going, I'm here for it, and I'm all about it. The other thing that was mentioned in that interview was also the kickoffs. So it sounds like the rules for the kickoffs are not going to adopt what the XFL was doing. And honestly, I don't really know how to feel about it, because if there was one thing that I did really like from the XFL, it was their kickoff rules with the whole making players wait and then going once the ball was caught. But apparently that's not going to be the case with what they do. I don't necessarily know if that means they're maybe going to err towards the USFL side of kickoff things. I'm not going to sit here and speculate on that, because it's not what I do. I don't like to just speculate on ideas. I like to just talk about what we know. And it just sounds like we're going to get a general idea of kickoffs from the 20, looking similar to what the NFL and college currently do. And I'm assuming maybe with a few adjustments with player safety in mind, whether it's just where the players are lined up and keeping them close to one another. And I think that's probably the route it's going to look like, something along those lines. But it sounds like we're not going to have the whole wait until the kick return receiver catches the ball and then everyone starts going, which honestly, I would have been interested in seeing in the UFL. So the fact that we're not getting it and it's kind of confirmed now, at least according to Anthony Becht, a little bit disappointing. And then finally, something I actually almost forgot to share with you all. I had to go ahead, that's why you saw the jump cut there. I had to go ahead and go pull this because I forgot to throw it in my notes earlier. There was a post made a few days ago by the USFLPA on Twitter. And if you don't follow them, I highly recommend you do so, because they do give you a lot of the nitty-gritty detailed information that has not really been shared by the league, because it's kind of stuff that's more important to the players to know than anything else, but it is also nice for us, the fans, to know as well. So I highly recommend you guys give them a follow. They gave out 4 different images in regards to just a whole bunch of different things that are going to be adjusted for this 2024 season, and a few things I really thought were worth mentioning that I pulled from it. The first thing being the contract term. Now, this is for just the USFL specifically, so keep in mind this doesn't speak on what the XFL was doing in 2023, but to give you an idea as to kind of how things have shifted per the USFL side, this is kind of how they're showing it out. The contract term from 2022 was basically through the entire year, January 1st to December 31st. It then got adjusted from January 1st to September 30th in 2023. Now, the USFLPA, though, with the union for the second year, has announced that the contract term is going to be from January 1st to August 24th. So that does actually shorten the contract length a little bit here. The active salary for players is going to be sitting at $5,500 a week. On top of that, there is like some more nitty-gritty numbers as far as to like how much these players will be making as like an inactive player or just being on a camp roster. Camp roster numbers are only $850 a week. But the one thing that really stuck out to me was the actual camp roster size, as this took a massive jump compared to what we saw from the USFL in the last couple of seasons, and that was the 58 number that they had been sticking with. This year, it has been completely just blown up. Nearly we're looking at 17 more people added to the roster size, as now for 2024 we have a 75 player roster size. Now that's not necessarily something new, it's kind of been out there in the ether for a while, but if you weren't aware, that number did get significantly increased, which means more opportunity for maybe another guy or two to be seen that wouldn't have been seen otherwise. So I thought that was really big on their part. The minimum active roster size was also increased, and this is another important piece of information as well. We're going from at least 40 players for the USFL to 42, which I'm going to be honest with you, That number, in my opinion, needs to be a little bit bigger. I really feel like minimum active roster should almost mimic what the NFL has with at least 46, and I'm honestly not a big fan of that number either. I don't really see why we have 53-man rosters in the NFL, and yet we limit the amount of active players to 46. It really makes no sense to me because you're just handicapping teams for whatever reason, and I would love to know the actual reasoning behind that. I personally feel like every person on your roster should be active at minimum, and that should be that. So I do think that number should just be capped out at whatever your team roster size is. Those guys are all there, suited up and ready to go. But that's just my 2 cents on that whole thing. As for that, there wasn't really a whole bunch of other massive changes here. There was the 5-game injured reserve seems to be what they're going with this year. So half the amount of the games that they play this season, which is going to be a 10-game slate assumed by everybody at this point. IR players will be receiving stipends, so they won't just be basically being lost out for a housing stipend, I should say, or should clarify. So they're not going to be losing out on things because they're sitting on the IR. And on top of that, the pay scale has been changed. There's been like some slight adjustments to concussion protocol and basically the baseline testing for that and how that's going to work. It sounds like they're going to be swapping to the neutral physician to resolve the type of disputes, which is actually different from years past, which is good because I feel like you need to have somebody that is not involved, that's only concerned about a player's health than anything else. Whereas like if it's a player appointed, they might err on the side of whatever the player wants because it's somebody that they went out and found themselves. If it's league appointed, maybe, because the league wants to keep people on the field if they can, they would try to do so and try to persuade them to do so. I like that it's a neutral physician approach. I do think that's really important. And also having a baseline testing to clear concussion protocol is definitely something that I think is very important to have, especially with the information that we now have in regards to how dangerous concussions are. But here was the last piece of information that I wanted to share from it that really stuck out to me, and I'm very curious as to what this actually means because it's kind of vague. Prior, the USFLPA, the way they had this lined up with the union, it was set up so that off-season play, you were allowed to play with the NFL and the NFL only. Now the verbiage has been changed to non-competitive leagues allowed. What does that actually mean? Is that just the NFL? Does that count against the CFL or for the CFL because they're in another country? Are they really a competitive league? Does it mean just other leagues that operate within the same time frame? Like, what is non-competitive leagues allowed? I feel like that's kind of vague verbiage in my opinion. So I would like to see a little more clarification on what that actually means. And I'd be curious if anyone maybe has any better idea than I do on that one. But that was something that I thought was important and worth pointing out there, because you go from specifying this is the league you can play in to now you're not specifying, which assume so. The whole idea is that this is to give people exposure to try to get back into the NFL. So obviously they're allowed to go there, but what are the other leagues you're allowed to play in when you're not playing during the UFL season? And like, can we just be a little bit more specific? That's kind of my takeaway from that. But that was just another tidbit of information I wanted to make sure that got out to you guys. Again, if you do not follow the USFLPA, they are the Players Association for the UFL. Check them out, follow along, see what they're talking about, because they do share a lot of information that just doesn't get announced by like the league. Like, this is something that got dropped that if you go to the UFL website, you're not going to find yourself. So I highly recommend you guys following them. But that's pretty much all the news from like the last 3, 4, 5 days or so, something along those lines. I'll continually update this as we go through. Like I said, UFL News Desk is literally just me reporting on the happenings of the UFL as we approach the season. We're basically all just kind of in limbo, waiting to hear more details from the league as these next few days kind of roll on. So I'm hoping that we start to get more and more announcements over the next few weeks as we approach training camp sooner and sooner. So that's it for me. If you made it to the end, as always, I greatly appreciate it. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.